name's David. I go by Holly Hacker on the Discord, and I'm pretty active in there. I will tell you guys, I really like talking just to listen to myself talk, so please interrupt me, or else we'll not talk about anything that I actually wrote down beforehand. But David, that just went before me, probably could have not set it up better. A lot of what he was describing and what it looks like and what you got to do is kind of the situation I got into about 2.5 years ago and said, okay, how are we going to go about actually being agents of change and kind of changing these things? I do have some mini badges to give away for folks that participate or want some mini badges, so participate, right? Just to give you some background, the network I'm working on and the scope of the system, 75,000 Chromebooks, Apple devices, Windows devices, 65 locations, some innumerable amount of personal devices that get connected to things they're not supposed to be connected to that I can't stop. So that's kind of the scope of what I'm trying to figure out here, and as we've gone through that. I wanted to start with a little bit of a game here. So this is kind of what my daily basis looks like when we start trying to remediate things. So I've got 2 example devices here. What can you tell me about these devices? Any guesses or what you can tell me about these things? Yeah.
Can you do a quick guess on the MAC address, see what type of device it is, if it's netted or if it's actually a registered HP book, Apple phone coming in, your IP address, if it's one of as it's on the network, if it's segmented, which one you're coming in through, and since they have set device names, I'm assuming whether it's NetBIOS or DNS hosting for the device name and pulling back into there, just kind of if it's matching, are you guys naming devices?
Great, yeah. So you just described what took me 4 months to figure out what I could learn from this. So I really appreciate that. Just as a little bit of a recap here, right? Something I didn't know a couple years ago is MAC addresses have kind of standardized format. So based on the first 2, I guess they're not octets, but the first 4 characters, they're actually a model identifier, oftentimes, or a manufacturer identifier, so you can tell if something's like HP or Apple or Dell until Apple introduced MAC address randomization, and now it's a little more complicated. Super useful if you want to do things like block Alexa on your network or other video game consoles, because they do have an identifiable MAC address range, so that's another little tip on how to block those to use that. From an IP address perspective, if you've got like a super awesome, cool network where you've got segmentation, this can tell you some things, right? Device naming, this can tell you some things. And ultimately, when we start talking about trying to remediate devices, I'm primarily talking about endpoint devices and what those things look like. And these are the types of things that was the data we sat down to look at to figure out, okay, how are we gonna get from point A of knowing it's an issue to point B of actually doing something about it? This is just essentially kind of what I was talking about, where there's a vendor code. This was something I didn't know that was super cool for me to kind of learn and figure out. And now as I've gotten used to it, it makes it a little bit easier. So when I'm looking at my firewall traffic and go, oh, that's what kind of device that is. And maybe it's really geeky to start memorizing like vendor codes for MAC addresses, but I mean, that's kind of how I've started to roll to help find those things. And then teach my folks who are working on remediating these devices how to use that information. So if I take you back in time a little bit, about 2 years ago, we ran a pen test and learned a whole lot from that. And one of the things they learned from that is that they needed a security manager, so that created my job, which I really appreciate. And then it created a bunch of kind of paranoia. And so a whole bunch of money got thrown at it. And so we bought a whole bunch of things, and we bought a SIM, and we did a bunch of firewall projects, and we hired a security manager, and we did new antivirus, and we did all of these things. And then about a year into it, it was like, whoa, what are we doing? Like, how is this stuff actually helping us succeed? So sometimes we talk about these business events or a breach or something that happens, and finally you get that money you've been waiting for forever, and we just start spending the money. You got to stop before you do that. And I realize it's rare for a school district to be like, hey, I got a bunch of money, and I started spending it. And this was COVID, and the government was just kind of throwing money out at school districts. But the other piece, too, is we thought that we had good enough executive buy-in because they were giving us money, right? Like, money talks. Ultimately, that's where we're going there. But we didn't necessarily get the buy-in we thought we needed. So we went through some steps. So based on kind of what we've mentioned a little bit so far, how hard do you think this is going to be, right? It's a huge network, right? How long do you think it would take to remediate the devices? Okay, so with an MDM, that could speed up that process. How efficient is your MDM? Do you measure that? Yeah, it's hit and miss, right? So MDM was a big piece of that. We do have an MDM, and one of the things that we did is there was a big focus on getting things in the MDM until I started to measure it and realize maybe the MDM is getting me to about 60, 70% compliance. So that's a huge help on the network. And then you end up kind of figuring out, okay, every idea I come up with is not going to be perfect. I don't have a silver bullet. And so I end up kind of having to figure out what's going to be the most important to me, right? Because the pen test and other tools give me this huge list of things that I needed to work on or do. And so I had all these different ideas about what we were going to do first, and I'm super excited, and here's all the things we need to do. So which one of these do you think I ended up picking first? All of them, right? I mean, this was the problem, right? I was starting to look like Dwight in my office with the, okay, like, they're like, all right, David, let's not have you be a chainsaw. Could you maybe be a weed whacker, right? Because I was just ready to go, right? So one of the things that eventually occurred to me, and you really hit it, and I have to admit, eventually there was 6 months of trying to do it all at once. The MDM became my biggest priority, because what can I do with the MDM? I can push out the rest. I can do the AV. I can do the OS. I can inventory it. Like, I could do all of those things. So my focus became, all right, stuff's got to get in the MDM. And there's tricks to that, right? But, you know, the worst one is the expense card where people just go, oh, hey, I need to buy a new MacBook, and I'm not going to wait for you to order it. And so how many of you have more than 10,000 devices named MacBook Air on your network, right? Like, or iPhone, right? Like, there's just and so one of the things we did is we established a budget priority for MDM licensing. So instead of screaming at everybody to stop buying devices, which we still kept doing, but since we couldn't stop it, the rule became, all right, fine, you have to let us put the management software on it. And don't do that again, not a user. But at least by putting the management license on it, we started to get somewhere. So I took some of the budget that we were spending or would have spent on some of these security tools and invested it in our licensing. And so my Apple, yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
I was going to ask, how do you enforce that MDM getting installed when user Bob goes to Best Buy, buys a MacBook? How do you got something at the network level that forces an MDM?
When you create that product that forces that compliance, please call me. Yeah. Sorry. The question was, do you have a way on the network that you enforce this type of compliance where you can't just bring devices to it? If you could invent an automated product for me for that, great. Please call me. When I ran smaller networks, if that was a baited question because you're a vendor, I really will talk to you after, please. But in a smaller network, you can get that granular and start controlling things with MAC address filtering or access tables. I've even experimented a little bit with certificate-based authentication on the Wi-Fi, right? So there is no username and password you can share with each other. But then you get into the business of managing certification certs, and Yeah, I'll jump off the stage here if we talk about that too much. But so there are ways in a smaller network. In my world, it just wasn't feasible to force it. One way we do control it a little bit is any licensed software. I took away the installers or the automated things that my end technicians were using for some of them. So you had to come through my system admin team or through a distribution process to get that licensed software. And I didn't give them the licensed software unless it was in the management system. So you don't get now it's still there. The guys on my staff sitting in the back are going, that still exists. But I pared down the amount of just, the IT share drive with all the installers on it, because that was a way to drive adoption. So that helped. The other thing that makes a big difference too is because of our content filter and our 802.1x authentication with the certificate changing every year, the users who refuse to let us get them enrolled in the MDM have definitely learned that it's painful. And so we've created some pain for those that refuse to let us. But it wasn't anything IT directly did. Sorry, the world changed. I can't get a security cert longer than a year. It's not my fault. So I don't get the political blame for it. It's just this thing I have to make work better. And it's like, all right, well, if you'll let us put it in the MDM. And so that's kind of what we looked at. I mean, from a results perspective, 2.5 years ago, I had about 6,000 devices in my Apple MDM, and I have 11,500 now. And so to me, that's a huge win. I'm super excited about that. And the Apple, now I'd rather just throw them all out, let's be clear. But But that has helped us so much as we've gone through cert changes or we're deploying a new AV or whatever the thing is that we're doing. Because it's in that management system, we've been able to be a lot more successful with it. So we were looking for low-hanging fruit type things. And we had this thing around for many, many years before I got there, that there was a way that devices were supposed to be named. We named them with a location code and an asset tag number. And so these were supposed to be super helpful for us to know where devices were. But of course, what devices are not compliant with that? The ones that are coming in from Best Buy or wherever else they're coming in from. But what rule do I have? If it's going in the MDM, I'm not putting it in the MDM until you fix the naming convention, right? And so I don't know if I realized how important the MDM became in this process until I started just now. Sorry, having an epiphany here. But as we established those rules, that helped us begin to drive that. And now, for a lot of my devices on the network, or in my firewall traffic, or in my SIM, or wherever I'm looking at it, I can tell you this is where this device is located. Or how many of you try to filter off of your remediation list personal devices? Right? We all try to do it. Has anybody found a super effective way to do it?
Well, what we're doing is it's not part of the domain and have a certificate. We go to a guest.
Okay. And so you've used some domain certificate enforcement. And so that really begins to help with that. One of the things that we were able to figure out is because we had established this naming convention, when I get a dump out of a log or a scanner that says, okay, here's all the devices on the network and I need to find the ones that I want to work on, I can now look for only devices that have a 3-digit code with a hyphen at the beginning of their name. And now all of a sudden I'm scraping out. Now I'm potentially losing the non-managed devices in here, but I'm now identifying stuff that has been named properly, that I potentially know some more about because it has an asset tag or a location information. And so we started to sort things by that. And then all of a sudden now I could generate a to-do list for people responsible for different locations, because I could generate, hey, this is where it's at based on the naming conventions. So I also, we had about 60% compliance on that when I looked at it. I haven't gotten a chance to really measure this yet, but I know that it just doesn't go in the MDM anymore without a proper name, and if we find them, we send them back and make them rename them, and that causes some user frustration. But it's user frustration with our own IT staff, and so we get to have put on your big boy pants, it's your job, instead of arguing with the user about what that difference is, until you have to reboot their machine to rename it and close their 100 Chrome tabs, because that's all something that... So one of the cool things that existed that my network team needs huge props for is the network segmentation that existed in place that we had naturally built as we went along. So that was something that existed and was there, and that became a huge source of information for us to also be able to add one more piece of the pie. Right? So now I can look at the naming convention, I can look at the MAC address, I can look at the IP address and know, like, this is where it is. And no, those are not my actual subnets. Give me some credit, right? Like, I do realize this is a security conference, I'm not drawing you a map, but this segmentation also made it so that I could start, and we're still working on this, and now that's big level stuff, as I call it, not endpoint, right? But now we can start doing things like east-west rules and application rules about flowing from one place to another, and VPN limitations. But you got to start at that fundamental level. So that network segmentation became a big deal. And even to migrate to that, right, we had to establish the VPN or the VLAN and build that segmentation, right? So each location has a segment, and then we've got a set of standardized VLANs, and then all the devices aren't magically on there, right? But as we run across them, we help move them to where they belong. Or then when we start blocking certain applications in the firewall from certain VLANs, this badge reader quit working, or this camera quit working. Why? Because you didn't have it where it belonged, right? So let's fix it. One of the other things too that helped us just with some clues where we were looking for these things and trying to determine unnamed devices that aren't following the string of things, right? When you do inventory scans, we started using an AV called Trend Micro, and one of the things they had was a discovery tool that would scan our network and say, here's the list of the devices that we see on the network that we want you to install our product on, right? Because they want to help you install their product, right? But it started giving us device names that we could then cross-reference into our computer objects in Active Directory and go, hey, what do we know about this, right? Because if I can start tying down usernames or what OU I had put it in for various reasons at some given point when it was configured, when they joined the domain, they needed blah, 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 blah. They didn't name the device right, but now I can cross-reference that back and deal with device renaming. And so that was another place that helped us learn some data. With all those pieces together, I can totally tell you it works, right? Like, what we identified as would be multi-year project and really still is this concept of if we establish these regular norms and those little rules become enforced, it's successful. And so when I can say things like, okay, the MDM had this many and now it has this many, right? Okay, or I had this many. This was a fun one when we went to change antiviruses. We didn't really know how many devices we had when we bought it, and so we kind of guessed. And then when it came up time for renewal, I had overguessed by like 5,000 devices. And so I saved some money just by actually knowing how many computers I had, right? But, you know, Ron Swanson really does have a good point, right? Since this project is never going to end, we're a government entity, so we can get away with this, right? But we're not getting fired based on the bottom line, right? So we're just going to keep saying it works. And if anybody asks you, it works really good. So thinking through the next step of kind of we identified those things, those were processes. As once we were focusing on the MDM and the naming conventions, we said, okay, we want the antivirus to really start helping us pay attention to these things. We made a significant change in what we were doing with our antivirus, so we changed providers, and we went to a level of antivirus that could give us a little better reporting about what kind of compliance there was. What's interesting about this is that we really had a lot of devices that were not, they weren't in compliance even when we had it, which led us to go, well, if I'm buying an antivirus and putting it on there and it's not updating or ever communicating again, why am I putting it there? Right? Like, I know it's a problem. And so we had to look at that prioritization and its ability to be persistent and check in and be friendly with MDM deployment policies or group policies that check if that's installed. That kind of invented what is, I think it's beloved, others probably do not, but we call it the master remediation sheet. And so we started out on our master remediation sheet with, okay, we're gonna fix antivirus. And so the entire IT staff, all the building technicians, network staff, system admin staff, everybody had lists of things that they could impact or pieces that they could do to help make these things happen. And it became a checklist, and we put it in a giant Google sheet because we're cheap and I don't have some fancy software for this, right? We put it in a giant Google sheet and we just started tracking it and checking them off and, doing call outs and little awesome, you get a gold star for folks that were extra focused on getting it taken care of. So as we did that, the remediation sheet kind of became this thing that started to grow. And if we go back to my previous point about you have to pick a priority, all of a sudden I had 1 tab, 2 tabs, 3 tabs, 4 tabs. We got to like 7 tabs on the remediation sheet. And it became very clear that there was some folks who were invested in this and working on it and working to remediate the devices that they had a circle of influence over, and some folks that were not. And so that actually helped us from a performance and measurement perspective, from a staff perspective, of a way to help measure and coach folks on what their roles are and how we can improve stuff on those devices. Then, once we started kind of working at that level, right, then we had to start working into things that we could begin to do at our larger staff groups, right, or our more advanced proficient staff groups. So it's the network. I'm just telling you right now, I manage the sysadmin, so it's all the network. And yeah, well, no, or someone can yell it's DNS, that's fine, whatever. But, right, so this is the problem, right? It's one thing's fault or the other thing's fault. And so what we've worked on establishing, except for us heckling each other from the back room, right, is it's not the network's fault, it's not the system's fault, it's our fault, it's our problem, we have to work on that. So the firewall rules we have been growing like a astronomical virus that were just being put there for a really long time, and we've now actually said, wait a minute, we have to kind of stop and start here and figure out where did all these rules come from, why are they there, what do they do, why does that particular server have the Windows firewall turned off? Like, I think I remember, like, we were on a Zoom call at some point and something wasn't working and we turned it off because everybody was screaming and it fixed it, and we forgot to go back and deal with it, right? Or actually fix, because that's a legitimate troubleshooting technique, right? Just turn off the firewall, right? Just turn off the AV. Those things work. Except, oh yeah, I'm going to have to go back when I've got a maintenance period and figure out what was actually wrong, right? So we started to identify things like that so that we could work on the more advanced things. If you don't have an understanding about what things are happening on your network and what applications live where, when you start trying to do things like east-west rules, it's going to get ugly, and it's going to get ugly in a hurry. And so it's worth gaining that type of knowledge about what's going on. So then the network staff's doing a lot of work, our endpoint technicians are doing a lot of work, and the system admins, they also said, all right, how can we contribute to this? I totally would love to have some budget for a nice, fancy Active Directory security tool that consistently scans. I don't, so we've sought out and used free tools. There's a company called I think it's Semprus. They make a tool called Purple Night that does a cool scanning of your Active Directory that's free, and it's even free without the sales pitch. We definitely got the sales pitch because of how much we were using the free tool. But it gives you some great best practices, like here are the things that are problems in your Active Directory that you should maybe fix, and here's a link to an article on how to deal with it. Then we found some, I can't remember the name of the tool now. We've been using a tool that will read the AD hashes and tell us like, oh, hey, these 6,000 users have the same password, right? Or their password has not been changed in 90 days or 180 days or, yeah, let's pretend all my passwords are not older than that. But as we've had that helped us to know we could answer management questions on like, hey, we want to change the password policy and increase the length. And then the management question is like, how many people is that going to impact? Well, everyone, right? Or now I could give them data that said, okay, we have 100,000 users in the domain and 60,000 of them have a password that doesn't meet these requirements. And so it's only going to impact 60,000, right? That sounds like low impact, right? So that was the type of thing where when we could put that business-like data, because of the information we were gathering, to answer the business decision-maker questions about what's going to happen when you press that button, that helped increase some of our executive buy-in on, okay, I actually believe you guys know what's going to happen when you press this button, and it's not going to break everything, and I'm not going to get a whole bunch of phone calls from the teachers or the public saying, oh my gosh, you broke it and I can't teach, right? This seems like a silly thing, but password policies, who likes password policies? People excited about that? Okay, somebody almost fell out of their chair there, so we do have somebody super excited about password policies. So tell me, what's the right password policy? Long? It depends on your environment. How often should you change them? Keep them long, change them often. It's like underwear, right? What about special characters, right? Like, there's a whole bunch of opinions out there about what it looks like. If you're trying to convince users to change it, if I have to teach my user, okay, uppercase, lowercase, special symbol, haiku, right? Like, if I have to teach them all of that stuff, guess what? I don't want anything to do with your new password policy. I need to resist this. And so we kind of picked it and said, you know what? Length is the thing that can make the biggest impact, so we're just going to go after length. And then we were able to slide in, oh yeah, if it's a known breached password, then can't use that one either. And so we take this and I wrote up this page-long document about this is why we want to do this, and this is why we want to do this, and give them to them, and they're like, right, so I read your document, but I'm not totally clear on what you want here, right? Because you've given me this how it impacts this group, and this group, and this group, and I realized that we didn't have enough pictures for the business people to help sell this concept. So one of my guys went and just got one of those charts that says, okay, when it's 6 characters long, this is how fast I can crack it, and 8 characters and 12, and just put that on the report, and they went, oh, we get it now. Okay, we can do this. So then, this was one of my favorite experiences of actually getting some executive buy-in, but we teach kids, right? So I have kids all the way from 5 to 6 years old, all the way into 18, 19 in school. So if I tell you your kindergartner now needs to remember a 10-digit password, how do you feel about that? Good luck, okay. What do you think my kindergarten teacher said to that? We're calling the union, right? Forget it, this is not happening, right? So guess what? My kindergartners have a lengthened password requirement. And we made a curriculum level argument about it. If I'm preparing students to be prepared for the real world, and this is what passwords need to be, aren't I responsible to teach digital literacy? Don't I actually need to start teaching them, even when they're that young, that this is what a secure password should be? So we want it from a curriculum-based, our duty or stewardship perspective is a totally different way to go about a password policy. And then some of the cabinet level executives said, okay, we're still going to get a lot of complaints about this. So change our passwords first so that we can deal with that pain, and then we can empathize and say, yeah, we know it's a pain, but we did it too. And it's okay. Digital literacy, you should be able to teach your kids how to do it. And we got approval from cabinet and said, okay, we can do it. And we got to go change kindergartner level passwords to a lengthened requirement. They're not all the same password. They're all unique. And the teacher has a way to know how to help them without printing out the passwords. And guess what? It does not take your entire class period to help all your kids log into a Chromebook. Would you believe that? Because I bet if beforehand you would have thought it did. But then we learned little things that helped, like by default on our Chromebook logins, the student was typing in their beginning of their email address in the domain. We realized that there was a setting in the GAC that could just automatically populate the domain name. So now the student only had to type in 5 characters instead of 14, right? And we began to try to approach that from the behavior perspective, and we got to implement a new password policy. And then, because we have our looping back around after 2 years pen test next week, we got to finally drop the hammer on all the password policies we tried to apply and gave everybody and their brother time and education to change, where I just went in and reset everybody's password who hasn't fixed it in the last 2 years. So now I will be clean for the pen test. But that is how we kind of built those. The guys in the back row are laughing at me about making the statement, we will be clean. But that's how we started to make some of those wins, by dividing those things out into those little chunks. What about you folks? What have you done to be successful in implementing password policies, right? We all fight about these. What's worked for you guys?
So we actually went to like curriculum or superintendent, whoever, and said we have a high percentage of our small password policies, like lengthwise, K through 3 or whatever, that are getting data breaches reported.
Okay.
Their password's getting compromised or whatever. The system still locked them out, but it said that they had the password. And they went, okay. And we kind of explained that length is super key. This summer, we made them all, I think, 15 plus characters, and we used single sign-on with ClassLink. Quick cards. So that helped us, at least with the younger grades.
Cool. So just for purposes of recording, hopefully I regurgitate this properly, but you had some small events tied around poor password policies, and you were able to use that with management to have some discussion about we need to potentially change this. So that helped us implement some complexity requirements, but then you introduced things like single sign-on, and you say like tapping badges? Or I'm not familiar with these, so this is, okay, like a QR code that could help them do that, right? So we've sought ways that it could be easier for users, but also be compliant with the password policy, right? Because when we start talking about password policies, everybody thinks we're Hulk showing them going, okay, change password, right? But you attached it to behavior in an ease of use method. So that's great. Any other good suggestions on that?
One thing we did, instead of saying 15 characters long, I just say it needs to be 3 words long. 3 words.
Okay, cool. 3 words. Instead of focusing on the number, I'm starting to teach the passphrase concept. I love it. I like that. That's great.
At a past company, we had PCI compliance. So my boss just literally sat down, figured out the monetary cost of fines that we would have for not passing compliance, took that to management, and management said do it.
Okay, yeah, so that using a direct cost model to drive those things, right? Sometimes I think as IT people, we have a tendency we miss some of that business side of it, or like the spreadsheet justification for that. But taking something like PCI compliance and saying, all right, this is what the fine would be if you don't do it, and this is what it would cost, all of a sudden someone that's actually got the approve button has got some good motivational understanding of what the financial impact of ignoring you is, right? Because does anyone feel like they get paid to yell into the void? Right? Like, I mean, that's why you come and volunteer to speak at SAINTCON, because then the people will give you feedback like you're not crazy, right? Like, we do at least identify with what's happening to you. Yeah, right. But so, I mean, as we go through those things, these are the type of things where it's useful to have those conversations. And for me and my career, one of the things that I found has helped when I'm talking through concepts like this is to be able to utilize my networks, right? In terms of, hey, if I go in the SAINTCON Discord and say, what's been your success or failed success in implementing a password policy? And how did you do it? Or, hey, I'm doing network segmentation and I'm a little bit lost, right? I mean, it's great when I can afford to have vendors come in and like help me with that stuff, but guess what? I need it free from the community. I'm a poor school district, right? So I need that help, and that can be a really big deal. So as we've gone through that process and we've gone through these things, a little bet came up. I mentioned we're doing our pen test next week. A little bet came up about what the score would be on the next pen test, right? Because my job was created from it, right? So I'm thinking, well, if we do worse, right? It's not like there's been less viruses and exploits in the last 2 years. What if we do worse? Are they gonna fire me, right? Like, I mean, how many CISOs get walked out the door for that stuff, right? Somebody's head's got to roll. Is my head gonna roll? And management's feeling like they've given us a lot of sponsorship and they've been supporting us, and so they're like, hey, right, we're gonna get a 7 out of 10. And that's a long distance from where we were, to be clear. And the management was having this conversation with a couple of the managers over the departments, and we all just started laughing because they were like, we're like, yeah, if we get the same score or maybe one better, we'll be happy. And this is one of those things I'm trying to figure out how to tie to the business objectives. So if somebody has some recommendations on that, please volunteer them, right? That actually getting the same score is actually good. Like, we didn't get worse, right? We're still educating kids. They're still graduating high school. But so then I got thinking about, wait a minute, there's a lot of stuff that I've learned over the last 2.5 years about how these things work and where my problems are, but did I write that down anywhere? Like, I mean, all my people who image computers now know I will beat them with the computer if they don't use the right naming convention, but like, did I publish an official document that said that? Or, hey, you know those 150 firewall rules we're trying to figure out what the heck they are and why they were put there in the first place? Wouldn't it be great if we had a document that told us why they were there and what the reason was there, beyond the little one sentence we might have put in when we implemented it? So we're kind of trying to work on next and what we're trying to get better at is documentation. And then I'm hoping that's my pass out of a bad score, because I can go, here's the risk register. We know about these things, so don't depreciate my score, right? That or a flat-out bribe. But maybe we'll do really well, and if we do, then they agreed to send me and the network manager to DEF CON and Black Hat, which is too expensive, and you can't go, but if we get a 7 out of 10 on the pen test, then we can go. Not holding out for that, though. But so that's kind of our goal in working on that. So, sorry, I'm going to use the network here, but can y'all folks share with me, like, how do you guys do this? What's a good way to do this? Because this is what I'm trying to figure out how to do next. I haven't gotten figured out how I'm going to do it. Yeah.
We've chosen to have like 3 or 4 different ways that we document it, so that whenever you try and look for it, you don't know where it is, and you have to go and look at all the different places and never find it.
Okay, so we're just going to start writing crap down, and then it's written down somewhere so we can sleep at night, right? I like that idea, and then we're just going to put it somewhere where we have no idea where it is. Okay, so I appreciate that. I would argue that that's how we get the Lego with 3 pieces and the board with 4, right? Like, maybe I am doing documentation. Gosh dang it, I'm doing that. I've got all kinds of Google documents and random things that we printed out off of a whiteboard in a drawer. I totally have documentation. That's a good point.
And we did have like one place that we were doing it at one point, and then we switched help desk software, and so then we exported all of that to a location, but we forgot some of it because that got left. You know, it's hard. It's really hard to do. It's hard to make it happen, and it's hard to keep it up to date.
Yeah. Do any of you have like a documentation person? Is that their job? I feel like that could be a job. I'm not sure who would take that job, but that could be a job.
So your ITSM is going to be critical.
Okay.
Shared folder on the shared file server, or if that's in with spreadsheets and all that, or an actual ITSM like ServiceNow.
Okay.
ServiceNow has great capabilities in regards to tracking issues, which is your risk register, and they have great modules for your GRC and different things like that that you can plug in as your quality control security module. And then you can plug your inventory into that and tie tasks and different things to that, to those different issues that you are currently tracking within your organization, including your policies, which enforce governance upon those things, in order for you to push those further and further and further and further. And say, hey, it's not me asking it, it's your management asking it, and I'm no longer the annoying security engineer that wants you.
So we found the guy that writes the documentation. He's right there, right? But just for repeating of recording purposes, right? So using an IT service management software, is that what ITSM stands for? Sure, whatever. Those acronyms can mean whatever we want, right? I mean, but yeah, so software to help us automate that, right? That's a great idea. Maybe that's something I ought to look at and potentially trying to use. I mean, because we have a tendency to just use Google as a go-to because we're a Google district, right? And we use Google Docs, but that's not the best way to organize things, I imagine.
I was going to say, build up on what the gentleman said. If you use incident management and catalog management, those are going to be the pieces of documentation to tell you why you changed the firewall rule, right? It was a request from John Doe, or we did it as a result of an incident that somebody submitted, right? And then you don't need a guy who does knowledge. Everybody's doing knowledge.
Okay, so start to track it based on incident when you change something.
Or a catalog request if it's not a break fix, right?
Okay.
So everybody's doing knowledge. You can query it. You can show it to anybody who asks. You can show it to the auditor, right? And you're set, right? Because it all lives in that document, in that tool, sorry, not ITSM.
And that feels a little less overwhelming, the concept of we start writing it down as we go, than going, okay, documentation, right? Because I'll do a follow-up next year and be like, how did we get to documentation? Hopefully there's enough progress to talk about that. Definitely a half hour, not an hour though. But so do it as you go along. That works. Are we doing that, guys? We've started to do a little bit better about that, right? It probably just is an unorganized Google document spread across 4 different places, but we're getting there, right?
I had one company I worked for, they tied it into change management. So anytime we wanted to change a firewall rule or make a major change, we had to submit a change management ticket into the ticketing software. It then got reviewed by other IT staff. Is this really a good idea? Is this the route we want to go with this? And we had to have a detailed plan in there in the change management of exactly what we were changing. And if we had to back it out, what was our back out plan? And so it was all documented through the ticketing software, so it was all centralized in that database.
Okay. So do you spend a lot of time in meetings more than you do making changes?
That company, yes.
Okay, so I mean, because that's one of the things. Because I've got awesome staff that work for me, but I'm at the management level of where it would be like, okay, go approve these changes. I do still want to work on stuff sometimes, but if I just, that's part of my problem with the change control thing. And there's no, documenting the oh crap plan is not fair, right? Like the oh crap, it didn't work plan. I can't document that ahead of time. That's no fun, right? That's half the job, right? But that's a great point, right? If we can at least, if we push this button, what's going to happen? And if what's going to happen doesn't happen the way we thought it was, how are we going to do it? True story, we used to have a shared calendar that was called the change management calendar. And they're like, this is our change management process. And I'm like, no, that's not a change management process. But okay, we're gonna have a calendar. Out of a joke one day, after listening to enough complaints, I went and renamed the change calendar. It's now called the Information Systems Potential Change Calendar. And we have figured out that if we put something on there with enough notice, and don't communicate it any other way because we never forget to communicate properly, that users or technical impacted users will call us and go, you're going to do what? You realize this will do X, Y, Z? And it's like, you know what? No, I didn't realize that, right? So we've kind of started advertising, this is the button we're going to push. But then we had to leave it potential because then people are like, you didn't push the button. And so now it's the potential change calendar. But so I really appreciate that. That's something we have to kind of continue to figure out, and as we grow and do that, right? Like I mentioned, we're getting a pen test next week. I am not stressing out about this or talking about this every third sentence at all, right? But part of the overall process that we've kind of gone around to with these tabs on the remediation sheet and each of those things, if it's been a year and a half since I was focusing and pushing people on you need to enroll it in the MDM, then I'm behind again already, right? So you have to establish a cadence, and by I mean you, I also mean me because I haven't, but I know I should, establish a cadence on how often we're going to assess these things to do that. I think that's the end of what I had in terms of prepared content, but tips, questions, emotional outbursts.
You mentioned that you used the tool to test your firewall rules before you implemented them. Was that Windows firewall you're talking about? And if so, what's the tool?
So we do that on our network firewall, and essentially what we've done is when we create a rule, without telling you too much about what firewalls I use, but when we create a rule, we put it in a logging mode or an information mode of the rule, and then we go and we let it run for, depending on how much of in a hurry or whatever we do it, we let it run for a week or a day or over a weekend, and then go, okay, what things we're talking to it and why? And that has helped us get a little better at the, oh crap, we changed that firewall rule and now nobody can get to XYZ, right? We didn't know. So just building the rule in a informational, or just building a report even that's going to tell you basically what the rule does has helped us get a lot better, and then given us a punch list of like, we got to go do these things before we change this rule. Now, kind of like I mentioned at the beginning, that's never going to be perfect, right? But that's one way and a best practice that a vendor taught us that's helped a lot. Anything else? Cool. Well, hey, I really appreciate it. Our antivirus vendor gave us a whole stack of mini badges they made to hand out. So if anybody wants a mini badge, I got a whole pile here. It's all assembled so you can plug it straight in. But thanks, I really appreciate it. And thanks for coming to SAINTCON.